Hi guys, so for your read aloud today, we will be reading chapter 8. Now, before I begin, I want to remind you what had happened, okay? So, Despereaux was with the princess and the king. The king realized he was a mouse and stomped his foot at him, and Despereaux was still really in love with the Princess P, okay? So I'm going to begin reading chapter 8. Chapter 8, To the Rats. The Mouse Council, 13 honored mice and one most very honored head mouse, heeded to the call of Leicester's drum and gathered in a small secret hole of King Philip's throne room. The 14 mice sat around a piece of wood balanced on spools of thread and listened in horror while Despereaux's father related a story of what Furlough had seen. At the foot of the king, said Leicester. His finger on top of his head, her finger on top of his head, said Leicester. He was looking up at her, and it was not in fear. The Mouse Council members listened, with their mouths open. They listened with their whiskers drooping and their ears flat against their heads. They listened in dismay and outrage and fear. When Leicester finished, there was a silence. There was a silence dismal and deep. Something intoned the most very honored head mouse is wrong with your son. He is not well. This goes beyond his fevers, beyond his large ears and his lack of growth. He is deeply disturbed, and his behavior endangers us all. Humans cannot be trusted. We know this to be an indisputable fact. A mouse who consorts with humans, a mouse who would sit at the foot of a man, a mouse who would allow a human to touch him. And here the entire Mouse Council indulged in a collective shiver of disgust. Cannot be trusted. This is the way of the world, our world. Fellow mice, it is my most fervent hope that Despereaux has not spoken to these humans. But obviously, we can assume nothing. And this is a time to act, not wonder. Leicester nodded his head in agreement, and the 12 other members of the Mouse Council nodded their heads too. We have no choice, said the head mouse. He must go to the dungeon. He pounded his fist on the table. He must go to the rats immediately. Members of the council, I will now ask you to vote. Those in favor of Despereaux being sent to the dungeon, say A. There was a chorus of sad A's. Those opposed, say nay. Silence reigned in the room. The only noise came from Leicester. He was crying, and 13 mice, ashamed for Leicester, looked away. Reader, can you imagine your own father not voting against you being sent to a dungeon full of rats? Can you imagine him not saying one word in your defense? Despereaux's father wept, and the most very honored head mouse beat his paw against the table again and said, Despereaux Chilling will appear before the mouse community. He will hear of his sins. He will be given a chance to deny them. If he does not deny them, he will be allowed to renounce them so that he may go to the dungeon with a pure heart. Despereaux Chilling is hereby called to sit with the Mouse Council. At least Leicester had the decency to weep at his act of perfidy. Reader, do you know what perfidy means? I have a feeling you do, based on the little scene that has just unfolded here. You should look up the word in your dictionary, just to be sure. So I'm going to stop here for a second, and I'm going to look up the word perfidy with you, okay? So I'm going to share my screen. Okay, I'm going to go, oops, not what I wanted. Define perfidy. Deceitfulness or untrustworthiness, okay? So that means that Lester was being untrustworthy or deceitful, okay? I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to continue reading, okay? I'm going to read the next chapter, which is chapter 9, The Right Question. The Mouse Council sent Furlough to collect Despereaux, and Furlough found his brother in the library standing on top of the great open book. His tail wrapped tightly around his feet, his small body shivering. Despereaux was reading the story out loud to himself. He was reading from the beginning so that he could get to the end, where the reader was assured that the knight and the fair maiden lived together happily ever after. He needed to say them aloud. I skipped a line, so I apologize. Live together happily ever after. Despereaux wanted to read those words, happily ever after. He needed to say them aloud. He needed some assurance that his feelings he had for Princess P, his love, would come to a good end. And so he was reading the story as if it were a spell, and the words of it, spoken aloud, could make magic happen. See here, said Furlough out loud to himself. He looked at his brother and looked away. This is just the kind of thing I'm talking about. This is exactly the kind of thing. What's he doing here, for Christ's sake? He's not eating the paper. He's talking to the paper. It's wrong, wrong, wrong. Hey, he said to Despereaux. Despereaux kept reading. Hey, shouted Furlough. Despereaux, the Mouse Council wants you. Pardon? Said Despereaux. He looked up from the book. The Mouse Council has called you to sit with them. Me, said Despereaux. You. I'm busy right now, said Despereaux, and he bent his head down again to the open book. Furlough sighed. Geez, he said. Cripes, nothing makes sense to this guy. Nothing. I was right to turn him in. He's sick. Furlough crawled up the chair leg and hopped onto the book. He sat next to Despereaux. He tapped him on the head once, twice. Hey, he said, the Mouse Council isn't asking. They're telling. They're commanding. You have to come with me right now. Despereaux turned to Furlough. Do you know what love is? He said. Huh? Love. Furlough shook his head. You're asking the wrong question, he said. The question you should be asking is why the Mouse Council wants to see you. There is somebody who loves me, he said Despereaux, and I love her, and that is the only thing that matters to me. Somebody loves you? Somebody who you love? What difference does it make? What matters is you're in a lot of trouble with the Mouse Council. Her name, said Despereaux, is P. What? The person who loves me, her name is P. Cripes, said Furlough. You're missing the whole point of everything here. You're missing the point of being a mouse. You're missing the point of being called to sit with the Mouse Council. You've got to come with me. It's the law. You've been called. Despereaux sighed. He reached out and touched the words fair maiden in the book. He traced them with one paw, and then he put his paw to his mouth. Cripes, said Furlough. You're making a fool of yourself. Let's go. I honor you, whispered Despereaux. I honor you. And then, reader, he followed Furlough over the book and down the chair leg, across the library floor to the waiting Mouse Council. He allowed his brother to lead him to his fate. So obviously he's going to be sent to the dungeon, but what do you think happens when he gets sent there? Why do you think it's such a bad place? They refer to the rats. Why do you think the rats are bad? And are they really?